Right now, other YouTubers are trying to talk about how Final Fantasy XIV disappointed them, how the newest expansion is one of the worst ever, how the story ruined the entire thing, how like the new girl is like one of the most Mary Sue characters in the entire history of Final Fantasy, how this is a bad expansion, right? They're sitting there trying to tell you that Final Fantasy XIV became bad, implying that it used to be good. And meanwhile, I'm sitting here talking about like, Final Fantasy XIV was always bad, right? When you have to shut down your MMO and then relaunch it a year and a half later to fix all the problems, yes, the game was a complete disaster right from the get-go. But because of the decline in popularity of WoW, because of the failures of every other MMO in existence, and because of like the rabid nature of Final Fantasy fanboys, Final Fantasy XIV has essentially kept Square Enix on life support for the past several years, right? Like the only reason Square Enix has been surviving like the PS4 era is because of Final Fantasy XIV. And it is one of the most embarrassing things I've ever seen, right? This was a game that clearly had a lot of problems right from the get go, but we've seen over and over and over again everyone trying to make excuses for it, everyone trying to justify it, everyone trying to tell you that like, no, no, you don't understand. They'll patch the game to be better. It's still better than WoW. Like they are essentially like the MMO equivalent of like those guys who try to tell you that like Nikkei has good gameplay. Like they're the Final Fantasy equivalents of those guys who try to justify throwing like $20 on like a swimsuit JPEG of like one of those girls. Like it's like, what are you doing? Like, what are you doing with yourself? Like, again, that is the Final Fantasy XIV audience, right? They have spent so much time playing this game. They have spent so much time committed to it. They have spent so much time, like, paying the fees and like paying for every expansion and like spending every waking moment, like, fishing and just going on these quest lines and doing all this stuff. Like, they have spent so much time obsessing over a below average product, a bad video game, they have somehow warped their perspective to the point where like they genuinely believe the game was always good and that this development is new and strange and awful for the community, that like this Final Fantasy 14 being bad is a new thing. Like, how dare they make Final Fantasy 14 a bad video game? How dare they do this to my MMO? The one MMO that stuck. Like, how dare they do this to Final Fantasy? Like, oh, I'm gonna blame woke culture. I'm gonna blame Square Enix. I'm gonna blame everyone except the game itself, right? Like, I'm going to make every excuse under the sun. I am going to do everything I can to protect this product, to protect Square Enix, to protect the people who allowed this to happen. And also, I'm going to post about how Final Fantasy 16 is also really good and that you're a bigot if you don't like it. Again, how have things gotten this bad? How exactly are people so delusional that they actually believe MMORPGs are like a good use of your time? Who out there seriously thinks that like, oh, I want to spend 4 hours every day playing MMOs so I can grind materials and like do absolutely nothing with my real life? Like who thinks that? Like, who looks at something like Final Fantasy 14 and is just like, oh, I want to spend my life playing that? Like, do something else. Go outside is my advice to you. Like, if you can grind money, you can get resources by working a job. You can socialize with other people by going outside. Okay? You don't need Final Fantasy 14. You don't need this video game to, like, to grind it, okay? Like, what exactly made you so enamored with this mediocre RPG? Like, what exactly got you so hooked on this mid product? Why exactly are you so obsessed with promoting this idea that this game was ever good? It's not. It never was. It never will be. And I have always maintained that. And again, this is the next step of the decline in Square Enix. Like, considering the failure of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which, by the way, most people are still in denial over, like, this is the end of their cash cow, I think. Like, if Final Fantasy XIV falls off, if people stop playing, if they stop paying for these expansions, like, the game is going to fade off into irrelevancy. And they will not be able to pull back their audience, right? It is going to stagnate. It is going to become irrelevant. It is not going to be able to remain competitive. Like, it is going to return to just a constant decline for Square Enix, right? It is going to be the next blunder in a long line of blunders. And I do think it needs to be said that this has been a long time coming. Square Enix deserves everything bad that happens to them. Final Fantasy XIV should not have released in the state it was back in the day, right? They should never have abandoned Nintendo hardware to develop exclusively for PlayStation, right? They should never have, like, just done everything they've done. Shafting classic IPs to the side, firing, like, iconic developers, like, completely failing to grow and evolve their brand in any meaningful way, completely, creating Final Fantasy X-2, like, one of the greatest, most abhorrent things in the history of video games. Like, if you really think about it, like, Square Enix is a cautionary tale of what developers believe, what will happen to developers if they turn against Nintendo, right? They thought that with their iconic Final Fantasy brand, which was one of the most lucrative at the time, that they could partner with PlayStation, that they could, make all of their games PlayStation exclusive, that they could make PlayStations fly off their shelves, and they would just be able to coast off of that, off of their Nintendo, off of the success they established in the Nintendo era, right? They thought people would coast off of the Final Fantasy VI, like, love forever. But, even when Final Fantasy VII came out, there were plenty of people who said that, like, wow, 6 was better on Super Nintendo. Final Fantasy VII is a massive step down, and that feeling kept growing with Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy IX, Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy X-2, Final Fantasy XI, which isn't even really an RPG, right? Final Fantasy XII, which is like some weird Xenoblade knockoff thing, like, again, Final Fantasy XIII, and now look at where we are now. Final Fantasy XIV, after a decade of support, over a decade of support, this is what the game has amounted to. An absolute disaster of a release that will lead to the further decline of Square Enix.